Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us on this snowy Missoula evening. We're delighted by the outstanding turnout, and filling the underground lecture hall has been one of my career ambitions, so I can check that off the box now. My name's Rick Van Den Paul. I serve as the director of the Institute for Educational Research and Service in the Phyllis J. Washington College of Education and Human Sciences. Our institute is the home of the National Native Children's Trauma Center under the direction of Marilyn Briere Zimmerman. And Marilyn and her team has spent the last 7 years or thereabouts working diligently in Indian country throughout the United States, and including Alaska. We've also done some work with children and youth exposed to trauma as a result of the Katrina and Rita hurricanes in New Orleans. Overall, the evidence that we've gathered suggests fairly powerfully that we've been successful in helping kids who have symptoms of acute trauma, kids who have part of a clinical diagnosis of PTSD, but certainly, in most cases, not full-blown clinical PTSD. But our work and the work of some of our colleagues, including Jessica Goodkind in the University of New Mexico Medical School, suggests that our ability to help kids with acute trauma really needs to be augmented by a better understanding of issues that occur when trauma is an ongoing source of stress in a child's life. When that trauma may be perpetrated by a presumably loving caregiver, or when that trauma is in fact worsening over time. Our ability to help those kids led us to turn to an individual whose teaching and writing has been among the most influential in my career. And really, I have the opportunity tonight to introduce someone who needs no introduction whatsoever. Nevertheless, I'll try. Bessel van der Kolk is a psychiatrist who has traveled the world teaching in most major universities and working with a variety of people, including a lot of indigenous people who have various sources of trauma in their lives. He's responsible for the term post-traumatic stress disorder developed during the Vietnam War to help us better understand the needs of our returning warriors from that conflict. He helped establish the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, of which Maryland Center is one member of about 70 trauma centers throughout the United States. And for the last few years, he's been helping a lot of us better understand issues around a condition that he refers to as developmental trauma. Not quite the same thing as PTSD, and certainly not the same thing as acute childhood traumatic stress. So this presentation by Dr. van der Kolk represents a kind of kickoff in a partnership between his center and ours and others throughout the nation that are trying to better understand how we can better support children and their families when there are issues regarding chronic, ongoing trauma in their lives. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bessel van der Kolk.
This is my second time. Can you hear me okay? This is my second time in Missoula. Last time I was here, I really liked so many of the people I met about a year and a half ago. And last night on the plane, I read the material that was sent to me, and I was sort of collapsed in horror about what you guys are coping with over here on the reservations. And wondered if I had anything to add. And then I met with so many people today in schools and in health centers and in child protective services, and boy, did I feel optimistic about your chance to make a significant difference in your world. So I'm really happy here to try to contribute to what you guys are already doing in such a major way. So maybe it's good to start with this. This past May, I was invited to testify for Senator Grassley's Committee on Foster Care. And I went down to the Senate and listened to 4 kids who had just matured out of foster care. And then it was my turn, and I thought these kids were so articulate that there was nothing else that I could add to it. And so all I said is, I just have one question. You guys keep bringing up words like treatment and therapy. So can the 4 of you tell me what treatment and therapy meant for you? And these were the answers. Treatment is a penalty to control my behavior. I was being medicated for something that happened to me. They gave me fake diagnoses, and boy, do I agree with that one, and labels that turned us into zombies. I could not function in school or be motivated for anything because of the medications. These diagnoses follow you for the rest of your life. We had no voice. We had to scream and act to be seen and heard. Medications cannot compensate for a lack of love. It is unbearable not to be seen, not to be known, to have nowhere to go and nothing to do. And I think this very much marks maybe many of the kids who we are concerned about here in Montana also. And so the question is, how can we make them be known, be seen, and not dope them up instead of paying attention to them? So historically, a similar issue has always happened to war veterans, and despite great promises to the contrary, that we'll never forget our veterans, the same thing is likely to happen after this war, because it always does. And so this whole PTSD understanding started in the late 1970s with an effort to press upon the VA that it was necessary to take care of these guys rather than pillory them by false diagnoses and dope them up and sending them away. And so it was an intensely political movement, like most of these movements are. And so a group of us, and certainly I did not coin the term at all, created the diagnosis of PTSD to capture more or less what happened to Vietnam veterans. It was not a scientific process, it was a political process. And as part of the political process, we needed to put very central the issue of people's memories, and that the memories were related to Vietnam. And so PTSD is a memory diagnosis that sort of ignores some very important things, because at that time we needed to really impress on the VA, this has to do with Vietnam and with memories of Vietnam. What we left out was some very important issues, namely how very difficult it is after a war to pay attention and to get joy, pleasure, and engagement with things other than war. How very difficult it is to deeply love and care for your children and your partners, and to cherish them because your mind is somewhere else and your body is set to react to danger and to basically nothing else. And the last scene of The Hurt Locker that won the Oscars, all the Oscars last year, was yet another war movie that really caught that issue precisely. But it was just one issue. And it's very interesting that right now a lot of money is being pumped into research and treatment of veterans, and it's very important. But we should not forget that for every veteran that is sent off overseas to fight these wars that we're fighting right now, as we always have done, always invading one country after another, there are 10 children, for every veteran who goes abroad to fight, there's 10 children in America who are being abused and neglected. And while it's great that the veterans are on people's radar screen, the children continue to be way off somewhere else. And the children being our future is a rather serious public health issue, and I think we're destroying ourselves as a nation by not paying deep attention to the issue of child abuse and neglect, as we are indeed doing. So after I left the VA, it's interesting how I left the VA. I was very dedicated to Vietnam veterans. I loved the work, loved working with them, did some research, and then I wrote my first grant on how trauma affects the brain to the VA. And my grant review came back, and the opening sentence of my grant review said, it has never been demonstrated that PTSD is relevant to the mission of the Veterans Administration. I closed my review, I walked into my director's office and said, I am resigning from this institution because my institution is more insane than your patients. You've got to be out of there. So the VA changed after that, hopefully. At least they talk about PTSD. But I can't, I'm like a tethered animal. Somebody has to do it. He will do it, great. So I went back to my old teaching hospital, where I was a student, and my patients started to present me with drawings like this. And suddenly what I'd seen with war veterans, I started to see everywhere. And I became curious about it. So I looked at that time, in my textbook of psychiatry, that I looked in to study for the board, and this is what my textbook said. Incest in the United States is very rare. It occurs in 1 out of 1.1 million women. At that time, there were 200 million women in America, 200 million people, 100 million women. So there's 110 women who has incest histories. And I thought to myself, how come 54 out of those 110 women have come to my office in the basement of the Massachusetts Mental Health Center? And then the textbooks also said that we don't really know if it's a source of serious psychopathology. In fact, the father-daughter liaison satisfied instinctual drives in the setting where mutual alliance with an omnipotent adult condones a transgression. It's an opportunity to test a fantasy, which consequences are found to be gratifying and pleasurable. It just goes on, you can read it yourself. And you don't know when you read something like that, you want to vomit, burst out in uncontrollable laughter, or take out an Uzi and mow some people down. I mean, how can you read something like this and not go like, this is crazy? The bad thing is that the textbooks of psychiatry today contain equally nonsensical statements that go unchallenged. And so it's very important for all of us to be very skeptical about authority, including my authority, I want to warn you. So what in fact do we measure? How uncommon is incest and stuff like that? It is a national epidemic. So a number of years ago, 10 years ago by now, Vincent Felitti, who was the head of internal medicine at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, treating a nice, largely white, middle-class, insured population, decided to do a survey among an internal medicine clinic over there. The initial data that I'll show you were of 13,000 people. At the end, there were 53,000 people in this study, the second largest epidemiological study in psychiatry, as far as I know, in the US. And it turns out that when you ask people, regular people, in your family, was there anybody who had a serious problem with alcohol abuse? 1 out of 4 Americans say, yes, that happened to me. When you ask Americans, when you were a kid, was somebody in your immediate environment depressed, suicidal, crazy, off the wall, angry, had to be hospitalized, was on drugs? 1 out of 8 people, 7 people, 6 people. When you were a kid, did you witness somebody hit, slap, kick your mother, or hit him with an object? 1 out of 8 people. The bad thing is that if you are a girl and you witness the abuse of your mother, your chances to expect and tolerate that in your relationship when you grow up goes up by a factor of about 150. If you're a boy who witnesses his mother being slapped and kicked around, your chances to treat your partner in a similar way goes up by a factor of about 200. So these are very serious issues. Physical abuse. When you ask people, when you were a kid, did somebody slap, kick, or hit you so hard it left bruises? almost 1 out of 3 Americans say, that happened to me. And in retrospect, people say, oh, it didn't matter. My father was one of these harsh Dutch guys who also did it to me. And as I've really delved deeper into my own personal work, it clearly was a very serious issue to have some gigantic person hit you when you're just a tiny little kid and you have no defenses. These things are serious matters. Even though because you love your daddy, you say, oh, it doesn't matter. That's the way my people did it. But in your whole heart and soul, you carry that feeling of resentment, that feeling of being weak, of being tiny, of being helpless, and you carry that out in your life. So these are big issues. And these issues, Valetti and Anda found out, have some major consequences on the organism. And psychologists go to school and they learn about talking in the mind. But this is not about talking in the mind. This is about the human organism. This is us. And when we are threatened and we are hurt, what it affects is not primarily our thinking, but it affects the part of our brain that's involved in survival. And so it affects our animal brain, our emotional brain. And I hope to have enough time to go into that, because if it affects our core system of how we perceive the world and move through it, not how we think about it, but how our bodies move through the world, then we need to develop treatments that actually address the limbic system, the survival system of the brain, and not pretend like we can change the survival system of the brain by talking about how bad we feel. I had that feeling. All right. So, when the whole organism is much better, huh? When the whole organism is under threat, I always need 2 people to sort of do this sort of stuff. So, the darkest bar is the more trauma you have in your childhood, the more likely you are to currently smoke. It goes up by a factor of 2.5. Actually, I like this much better, yeah. I think they like it better too. The more trauma you have, the more likely you are, no, this is better. I'm doing this in honor of Aretha Franklin, who will die soon, and so, so the more trauma you have, the more likely you are to grow up obese. And one of the sad things about the Obamas, who I was totally in love with when we elected him a few years ago, is that Michelle Obama is doing the same thing as Nancy Reagan is doing. And when Nancy Reagan became the president's wife, she said, I will take one big issue in our society, and drug abuse. And her simplistic answer was, just say no to drugs. It leaves a little of profound understanding about the issue of drug abuse. You know? And now Michelle is doing the same thing to us. She has taken on obesity, but nobody is talking about helplessness, trauma, and despising your body, which are all our antecedents of people becoming obese. It has to do with social circumstances of helplessness and despair and not loving your own being, which has to do with trauma and neglect. Depression. We all learned that depression is a genetic illness. This morning, one of my esteemed colleagues said, trauma and comorbid depressions. There is no such thing as comorbid depression, because we are one unitary human being who feels all these things, not according to categories, but we feel the whole thing. So depression is common. So 14% of the population gets depressed, even though they have been abused. But if you have been severely abused as a child, your chances are that you will lose 2 weeks or more of work per year to depression. The interesting thing also is that this population responds to antidepressants, and this population does not respond to antidepressants, but responds to intensive psychotherapy. But we continue to drug these people up and don't really look at what it is about their internal world and their internal composition that causes them to collapse, to despair, and unable to take effective action. Suicide attempts. Now this is rather relevant to what's going on in your community. And it's again relevant in terms of how we dissociate these things off. So what we see here is that if you have no childhood trauma, your chances to commit suicide are extremely low. The more childhood trauma you get, the more likely you are to commit suicide. In fact, they calculated this out, and we used it in our last grant application to NIDA, which was turned down, in which we said that if you have been abused and or neglected as a child, your chances to become a drug addict go up by a factor of 4,600%. There is nothing that predicts drug abuse with this power. It's about childhood trauma and neglect. As long as you know that somebody can provide you with a safe place, that somebody will hold you when you feel terrible, when somebody loves you and will take you for no matter what, people don't commit suicide by and large. It is when you have no place to go to and no place to run and nothing to look forward to that you kill yourself. If you kill yourself as a 7, 8 or 9-year-old, that means that you know stuff you shouldn't be knowing about life. And it's also interesting that a few years ago, a friend of mine was elected president of the World Mental Health Foundation, so he went to his dinner to celebrate his... What's with the batteries here? To celebrate his election. And I sat next to the Surgeon General of the US, Dr. Thatcher at the time, and he turned towards me and said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Dr. Van der Kolk, what do you do?" I said, "I'm a psychiatrist." And he said, "I love psychiatrists." And I said, "That's amazing. Nobody has ever told me they love psychiatrists." I mean, that is bizarre. And tomorrow you'll see that, because I have an article coming out in the New York Times about the epidemic of youth suicide in America, in which I say that psychiatry is the answer to that. I said, that is so great, because this study, which you are familiar with because it came out of the CDC, of which he's the head, he shows about the correlation between childhood trauma and youth suicide. And it's so important because right now we are actually having a youth suicide epidemic in South Boston, this cute little neighborhood that shows up in all the movies about Boston, where it turns out that what we are uncovering is a huge amount of domestic violence and childhood abuse as the antecedent of youth suicide, just as your study shows. So I'm really looking forward to the front page of the New York Times showing that. And Dr. Thatcher says to me, "Oh, I decided to leave that out because it was politically too sensitive." Our dinner was fairly strained after that. Alcoholism. We know it's a genetic illness. You get it from being Dutch or Swedish or Finnish or Irish or Native American. But if you have a safe childhood, your chances to become an alcoholic are really pretty slim. Well, your chances go up more and more if you're traumatized. Drugs, just say no to drugs. But I have a very good example with my own children. My own children grew up in a very privileged society, part of the epidemic world in Boston. And much to my amazement, I found out that my kids smoked dope sometimes. It did not cause a crisis in my family. Because my kids love to play tennis, and they love to dance, and they love to write plays, and do performances, and do math. And you can't do any of that good stuff when you're stoned. So I was never worried that my kids would become drug addicts because they had too much to live for, and too many things made them high about real life. But if you have nothing that gives you pleasure and joy in life, drugs are the answer. And so if you say no to drugs, so what are you going to help these kids with that makes them feel alive and relevant and important and feel their bodies feel great? Huh? So if you give up on drugs, at least do tango dancing or something like that that make you feel alive. Huh? And it just goes on. It goes on and on and on. And then you get into all these illnesses. And that if your core regulatory system is messed up, it increases your chances to currently suffer from any of the leading causes of death in America. And so trauma, an enormous amount of medical illness, and the enormous healthcare expenses of our country are again closely correlated to each other. And when people say that I said that child abuse and neglect is our biggest public health issue, that doesn't come from me. It comes from Robert Ende of the Center of Disease Control, who, when I hear him present these data for the first time, he's a nerd, he's a statistician, he sits on computers tabulating data. He's a tobacco researcher. And I sit next to this guy, he presents his data, he bursts out crying. He said, I thought we were just going to study obesity. What we found is the biggest public health issue in America, which at the end is more costly than cancer or heart disease. And if we could take care of our children the way we should, more than half of all depression would disappear, the majority of suicides would disappear, 2/3 of alcoholism would disappear, 3/4 of IV drug abuse, 2/3 of domestic assaults, and half of domestic violence. This is the issue. And that's why almost every seat in this room is filled, because you also on some level know it's the issue. And yet we continue to dissociate this off and keep talking nonsense and call our children bipolar disorder. Because their systems are really messed up, and we give $16.3 billion of antipsychotic drugs to our children. It happens to be so that those antipsychotic drugs shut off the reward system of the brain. If you're a growing person, you want to be excited about stuff. You want to be motivated about stuff. The New York Times has some great articles about this, but nobody seems to be really taking it seriously. If you dope up hundreds of thousands of children, millions of children possibly in America, with antipsychotic drugs, these children will never be seriously contributing members of our society, because you kill the reward system that you need in order to feel pleasure and joy in what you're doing. This is serious. I would almost like to stop here at this point because it's so important. There's this whole issue of PTSD. And the whole issue of who's causing what, and is it trauma. And I was sort of bemused and slightly irritated this morning when we started our discussion talking about PTSD. PTSD is a diagnosis that we concocted, made up, put together, whatever it is, in order to more or less capture what adults who go to war, who are being exposed to horrendous stuff, with a mature brain. That's not what kids suffer from. They don't suffer from PTSD because they have a brain that is very immature. And being chronically terrified, being chronically neglected and abandoned changes your brain and forms your brain in very profound ways. And actually that is sort of my major issue. My research and my clinical intervention is how we can change the brain after it has been changed by trauma. And what we now find is in our traumatized kids is that the pure PTSD symptoms, nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive recollections, are indeed related to specific traumas. But all the major stuff that we're finding, namely affect dysregulation, not being able to calm yourself down, always being on the edge. Hold a second. That is my son calling me. I'll just have to decline that for now. Had it the biological abnormalities of not being able to regulate yourself, the biological abnormalities of engaging in self-injurious behavior, the abnormalities of not being able to negotiate safe interpersonal relationships, to beat each other up, or to trouble each other, the basic feeling of alienation, loneliness, not belonging, the issue of getting hurt over and over again. Those are do not have to do primarily with specific traumas, but they're all issues that have to do with the safety of the attachment system. And that is something that we are loath to really talk about. And it certainly is a very big issue in your community, because there is a great deal of lack of safety and a great deal of active victimization and abuse of children that goes on. And if you do that, you change your children's brain in a way that it's going to be very, very difficult for them to have a life that is filled with intimacy pleasure, joy, and belonging. So we're talking about very, very serious stuff. Okay, I'm going to go through this quickly. How does our brain grow? Our brain goes, as all of us know on some level. I'd love to show movies here. I think I did last time I was here. Our brain grows through rhythmical interactions between us and other people. And the sort of interactions Richard and I have had all day of telling a story and telling another story and going back and forth and laughing and being upset. That's sort of how our brain grows. The more interactions we have with each other, the more our brain grows. Our brain grows through challenges in a use-dependent manner. And so it's interesting for me that the standard textbook on mother-infant interactions that I had next to me before I had kids was this one. And it's still standing right next to my ear in my office. And I thought, oh, that's what it's like to have a child. How wonderful. And then I had children of my own, one of whom just called me. I thought, boy, this woman doesn't know anything about what it's like to have a kid. And I mean, she is out to lunch. I mean, this is so not what it's like to have a kid. And I Googled her, Mary Cassatt, and not to my surprise, I found out that she was an unmarried single person who always wanted to have a baby. I said, yeah, if you're an unmarried single person, that's what you think it is like, but boy, that's not really how it's like. It's much more complicated. And so here's a composite picture, largely from our own family photo album. This is the kid who just called me. And so what the child's reading like is that kids are very dysregulated little creatures. And they cry and they sleep and they scream and they wake you up in the middle of the night. And if you're a well-regulated adult, you know how difficult it is. So even if you're married to somebody you really like, your kid wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you say, hey honey, your kid is crying. Huh? So you help each other to regulate yourself, and then you go back to bed, somebody holds you, and then one of you gets selected to do it. And then when you pick this kid up, I say, actually, it's sort of nice to hold this kid, and you quiet yourself down. If you're by yourself, and you've had a rough day, and it's always you, your heart may be pumping. And if you're a traumatized person, to whom noises are particularly triggering, and your loneliness is particularly triggering, and that kid is screaming once again, your chances to pick that kid up and to make it feel calm go way down, because your own physiology by that time is maybe so upset. Instead of holding that kid, you may actually hit that kid because you're so frustrated. So this is really tough stuff. It's hard to raise a kid by yourself, particularly if you're traumatized. And to negotiate all of this, we now really understand what happens in the brain, how this all grows. But to just give you, let me just give you an example of how this goes. I hope this is working. Yeah, it's working. So this is how people get regulated. So no word gets spoken, but our brain grows and quiets itself down through rhythmical interactions, motoric interactions with other people. And so I was surprised today. We went to a school that I loved, where a bunch of first graders were talking about how does it feel like to help somebody. And it wasn't working because these kids were just frozen. And the teacher was trying very hard to get these kids to talk about what is helping somebody. But she didn't get it. Because helping somebody is that. It's a motoric act. It's something you do with your body. It's not something you do with your prefrontal cortex. And so if you want to help people to instill the capacity to really know something, to learn something, they need to do it. They need to engage in something. Our field is being ruined by psychologists who sit on their asses in the chair talking about what it's like to be nice to somebody. But to be nice to somebody, you have to be nice to somebody and do it and feel in your body what it feels like to be nice to it. We shouldn't talk to kids about how you should protect yourself and say no. No, you should do it. You should act and say no. And you send your kids to self-defense classes and to action classes where their bodies learn how to say no. Your mind can tell stories, but your body has to practice it. And this is how we learn. In fact, this picture is of a 6-hour-old baby with his father. And this baby is already imitating his father's movement. So the way that we learn and the way that we are geared is to imitate each other's actions. Not to yak, but to do things. Right? And that's why we do Qigong, right? So this is sort of a typical interaction between that rhythmical interaction. So here's a little boy from the lab of my friend Ed Tronick in Boston, who is just having a great time pulling his mother's hair. And the reason why he's so cheerful, even though she's screaming her lungs out, is because he has no frontal lobe. Well, the reason that I got interested in trauma, one of the many reasons, is that little boy who just called me was an extremely dysregulated and difficult child. Kept it up all night, kept it up for years. And my veterans I was treating were just like my kid. So I had this 2-year-old kid at home who was out of control little monster. And I had these Vietnam veterans who were out of control big monsters. And I thought to myself, how interesting. I'm pretty optimistic about my kid, and that someday my kid will actually learn to regulate himself. And I'm curious what it takes in his brain to at some point become a well-regulated adult. And I thought, what the hell is going on with my Vietnam veterans that they're behaving like a 2-year-old? What has broken down in their brains that makes them so reactive and out of control? So that really was the basis of my study, and it all has to do with not having a frontal lobe at some point. Well, you know, your frontal lobe is something you need in order to talk. Now, if you don't have a frontal lobe, which happens when people are in the middle of their trauma, our research shows it very clearly, that the frontal lobe goes offline. The idea that you do cognitive therapy with somebody is bizarre. Like, you know, when somebody doesn't have this part of their brain, you can't work with that part of the brain. So, you know, it's a waste of time. You don't say to this little boy, oh, you know, you shouldn't be doing this because your mom is really hurting and she'll like you much better if you stop pulling yourself. That's a waste of time. So mom starts off having a very nice big frontal lobe, but as her pain becomes greater, her frontal lobe starts disappearing also. So that happens to all of us. The more scared, hurt, etc. we become, the more we take leave of our senses, and we become animals. So traumatized people become like animals when they feel scared. So mom becomes like an animal, and now they start fighting for their lives, like two animals. And luckily, mom is bigger than the baby, and wins this fight for survival. And because of that, the boy is still alive, because if he had fought, well, she would be dead. So now this little boy has a little piece of his brain over here called the amygdala that is the smoke detector of the brain. It tells you what is dangerous, what is safe, and that smoke detector is just becoming online and is being formed right now because of his experiences. That is your limbic brain. And your limbic brain is entirely a brain that is developed in a use-dependent way. So if you're scared all the time, you develop a brain that is focused on dealing with threat and danger. If you live in safe surroundings, the natural organization of the brain is about curiosity, play, messing around, fooling around with people. That's who we naturally are. But if you're scared all the time, whether somebody's going to be alive or somebody's going to hit you or hurt you, the part of your brain that has to do with fear and terror becomes the dominant part of your brain. Very hard to change once the brain gets hardwired in a particular way. And don't buy any things, like I was doing this workshop this past week, and a bunch of people in my class were sitting with the 1-minute solution to trauma, or stuff like that. You don't rewire the brain in 1 minute. This is very complicated, actually. And we saw that in the various places we went. Okay, so this kid has a little amygdala that's being formed, and he sees that his mom is scary, and so what do kids do at this point? They close their eyes to the danger and go into denial. Traumatized kids close themselves down and don't see anything anymore either. So if a scared kid takes leave of their environment, loses their curiosity, and what does mom do now? This is a normal thing that you see all over the world, as she starts messing with this kid in the universal language of mothers and children. And she goes, doo-doo, dada, oh my little baby, she kills him, and you see that in China, you see it in Africa, you see it everywhere in the world, everybody knows what's going on. It's a rhythmical, musical interaction between mothers and children, and so this kid feels the tickling, and he hears all these funny sounds, and it makes him feel safe and calm and good. At some point he looks out, and he sees a kind face, and they get back reunited in a sense of safety. And this is how children's brains grow, by becoming scared and being quieted down, becoming scared and being quieted down. If I had a lot of time, I would tell you all the research that shows that if this mom's face remains frozen, this kid's brain changes and cannot reset itself. In this case, the kid's brain will actually become very reactive to threat or chronically shut itself down to pleasure and joy in human interactions. Something probably quite familiar to many you over here. So we do that through systems that are in our brain that have to do with our mirror neuron system, by picking up other people's movements, other people's senses, and reflecting them. I see almost everybody in this room, much to my delight, is staring at me, and what they look at is the way you hold your neck. And the way that when I talk like this, you stick your neck out, just like those little babies and their father. You don't change very much. You can see how interested you are in what I'm saying. It's thank you. That's very good. And so you show it in your body, and when I say something that's interesting to you, you feel almost as if you're saying something interesting. Because that's how our brains work. And if I become boring and my accent becomes worse, you feel like you don't have a voice anymore, and you feel boring yourself, and everybody goes home and is totally defeated and resented and that. And so we have a profound influence on each other's neurobiology. Now, this is important. Like this is, I have this colleague by the name of Bruce Perry, and Bruce and I trained at the same time. He was at Yale, I was at Harvard, and I hadn't seen him for like 20 years or something. And then a funny thing happened to us. We were invited by the British Parliament to tell those guys who were writing laws on what is happening in child abuse and neglect, to inform the laws of Great Britain and policy. Can you imagine being invited by the state legislature to actually learn about child abuse and neglect so they can write laws that will help people to deal with this stuff? Like, no, we want to talk about gay rights and what you do in people's bedrooms. That is our main preoccupation, rather than how you can really help to create a safe society. Like, that's not what we talk about. So what does he show to the British Parliament is some study he did. So here's a group of 38 kids and a number of really pleasurable interactions with people in their environment. So first thing in the morning, kid wakes up, in a circle is his mom, bunch of interactions with mom, then mom seems to go to work or goes away, and then there's a number of interactions with other family members, and then the kid goes to nursery school and has a lot of interaction with people throughout the day, some interaction with strangers. Nursery school, comes home late. Clearly a hard-working family, parents, kid comes home late, has some more interactions, and that's the number of interactions of two parents, well-situated group of people. This is the contrast with kids who are being raised by themselves by a single mother who lives in poverty. Kid wakes up, one interaction with mom, plunked in front of television. For God's sake, please shoot your television. Even Sesame Street kills your child brain. Your brain grows through human interactions. By being with other people, talking with other people, messing with other people, pulling other people's hair, whatever the hell you do, whatever we do with other people, so we integrate it, that's how our brain grows. Not nearly as good at kindergarten. These kids' IQ is 35 points lower the IQs of the kids with two parents. As a nation, you cannot afford to have a large, substantial proportion of your population grow up like this, because the people in Singapore and Shanghai and in India will raise their kids under better position, and you will lose the race for survival among nations. You know, sort of big thing. So again, how does our brain form? We need positive human interactions, and those positive interactions stimulate the reward system of the brain. And once the reward system of the brain is stimulated, you feel a sensation of pleasure, calm, and safety. And you release the hormones that take care of illnesses, your immune system is proper, and if you have a lot of good, positive human interactions, your body is interested, excited, takes care of itself, doesn't grow obese, etc., etc. So if that avenue is shut off, then that reward system in the brain still needs to be stimulated. Somehow you need to calm the system down. The oldest way of doing that, we started in Northern Europe, but it's moved to the plains also, is to take alcohol. Alcohol is a very efficient way of dealing with that system if interpersonal relationships break down. And if alcohol doesn't do it, you can always take sweet, salty, and fatty foods, because it will go into the same system. And it has something to do with obesity. And if that doesn't work, you can always take drugs of abuse, cocaine, heroin, stimulants, and that will do it. So you can say no to drugs, but then you have to go to McDonald's. And if you can't go to McDonald's, you have to go to the barroom. If you don't address this core issue of self-regulation, you're damned. Because that system of the brain, it keeps you going. I'm going to skip this one. This is an important slide. I can give you a long or short story behind it. I'll give you the medium story. This is a study done by a friend of mine, Frank Putnam, a man I love and admire greatly. Frank was at the National Institute of Health, and he, like I, got very interested in childhood sexual abuse and how it led to dissociative symptoms, people being out of it, people hurting themselves, people attracting more hurt to themselves, and we were very interested in how that happened. And we would go to the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, and ask people about this stuff. And they would say to us, Frank and Bessel, you guys are obsessed with this childhood sexual abuse. Don't you understand? This is a genetic issue. And that if you are genetically vulnerable and you're 4 years old and you get raped by your uncle, you take it badly. But if you're genetically okay, it's just cool. And we thought, who are these monsters? Who are the most prominent people in our profession? And so Frank and I went home after that particular thing. He changed his career, I changed my career in different ways. And Frank went home and said, I'm going to show what happens as a result of childhood sexual abuse. So he went to the welfare department of the District of Columbia and said, can I study 100 girls who have been sexually abused, where everything has been confirmed, they have gone to the sexual abuse examination, it's all true. And then we're going to find 100 girls matched for race, family status, etc., who have not been sexually abused. And I'm going to follow them up for the rest of my life. And indeed, Frank is still following them up. And it's now 25 years ago that the study started. And every 4 years, he measures these kids, he measures their mothers, they all have kids now, and he measures their kids. So he has a wealth of data on all these women and over generations. And what's also interesting, actually, is that Frank, who is the smartest, I don't know a bunch of smartest people, but he's one of the smartest people I know. Every time he publishes a paper, people take an office away from him at the National Institute of Health. And they take our telephone out. And they take away a research assistant. His last year that Frank Putnam was at the National Institute of Health, he was not allowed to do research anymore. He was only allowed to do physical examinations for his colleagues who were doing real science.
It breaks my heart to just remember how this is, when you tell a doctor all you can do is physical, that means that's the ultimate humiliating thing. So you're studying the wrong subject. And then the question is always, why are you not allowed to talk about this? Why are you not allowed to study this? Why does it kill people? And I leave it up to your imagination, because I don't want to sound like a paranoid schizophrenic when I talk about why I think that is. So here's about all these data. And here's a very simple slide, taken at the time 3. The girls are now teenagers, late teenagers. And he looks at a very simple thing. The number of people in the peer groups, a number of peers of the opposite sex that these girls have. So this is the normal group. And the normal group of non-abused girls, before the onset of puberty, hang out with one boy. My daughter was one of them also. They snarl one little boy to be the informant about what the strange creatures boys do and what they talk about and what interests boys. There's spies in the opposite camp. And then after girls enter puberty, they slowly increase the amount of contact they have with boys. The abused girls have a totally different trajectory. Before the onset of puberty, they have no contact with boys whatsoever. And after the onset of puberty, they have a lot of contact with boys, oftentimes of a very dangerous and frightening variety. So that seems not so interesting and pretty obvious. But what's underneath it is important. What's underneath it is the issue of normal child development. What do normal girls do who are in 4th or 5th grade? What they do is they harass each other. They put each other down. They are miserable creatures. If you ever become a feminist and say that men are awful and women are beautiful, just hang out with 4th and 5th grade girls sometimes, and you'll know that women can just be as nasty, particularly at that age. It's just unbelievable. And you know, there is something beautiful about it. I don't know who created this system, but you know what's so great? This happens just before puberty. And it's a time that girls do terrible, mean things to each other. And what happens is that they learn about heartbreak, they learn about betrayal, they learn about how untrustworthy people are, and they learn how to defend themselves. They learn to stand up for themselves, they learn to fight back, they learn to talk about their feelings, they have endless phone calls with friends, look what you did to me, and they develop a language for the internal world, they develop a language for themselves in relationship to the world around them. It is miraculous. It is just so beautiful what comes out of it. And what comes out of it is that once these girls enter the world of heterosexual relationships, which are much higher risk, they have all kind of tools in their tool bag that they have learned from their girlfriends. And they have a ready-made critical stress in the debriefing system with whom they can talk about sex and not do it all the time. So that's quite nice. I don't believe in evolution anymore. This was so damn clever that I don't think that it's just evolution. Abused girls have a totally different trajectory. They hang out with nobody because they are so weird. They're so frozen. They're so explosive. They're so angry. They suddenly burst out crying. And they're just difficult, weird, impossible kids. And nobody wants to have anything to do with them. Because of that, they have no girlfriends. They have no boyfriends. And they're by themselves. And they miss that critical developmental issue. Namely, I was talking to somebody yesterday and everybody burst out laughing about parents. And they said, well, the most important thing is to have one person to care for you. And then the person I was talking to said, well, all the other thing is that you should have 2 not insane parents. And I said, that may be too much to ask for. But, you know, because if you have insane parents, you have a bunch of friends. You can make up for it somewhere. Your friends make up for all these crazy parents all of us have. But if you cannot form friendships, and your parents are abusing you and neglecting you, you're done for, because you learn none of the regulatory skills that you need. And then these girls go into puberty, and something else happens. And what happens here is that the hormonal system in the brain changes. So now you get into biology in the brain. And what happens is that the sexually abused girls develop a year and a half earlier than the non-sexually abused girls. They start pumping out sex hormones, develop breasts, pubic hair, start menstruating, ovulating. They become attractive to other boys. They want to do it. And not only that, but when Frank measures the sex hormones, it turns out these girls secrete between 3 and 5 times as many sex hormones as the non-sexually abused girls. Fatal. It's hard enough to deal and control and manage your sexuality with excessive amount of sex hormones that you get as a normal person. But if you get between 3 times and 5 times as many, things are out of control. And if you have not developed all of that other stuff, of friendships and talking and negotiating, adolescence becomes really, really, really difficult. And terrible things start happening to these girls in adolescence. And then, oftentimes, somewhere over here, somebody realizes, this girl was sexually abused, and say, oh, let's give her PTSD treatment. They go, oh no, that is so crazy. You know, that's not what happened to this girl. What happened to this girl is probably that before she was molested, she had parents, probably a mother, who didn't know how to take care of her, which set her up to become sexually abused. And so it starts off with the attachment system. And then they get sexually abused. And then they are so weird that nobody plays with them. And they're so out of control. So this whole repair of pre-adolescence doesn't take place. And then they have horrible adolescences in which one terrible thing after another happens to them. And to say, let's just reduce it to the PTSD of the sexual abuse is crazy. And to have that model really doesn't help anybody, because it really doesn't take care of things. And so if you would ask me, so where do you intervene with all the problems that people have? My personal inclination has always been that friendship is terribly important. And feeling like you're part of the human race. And so to me, maybe repairing this deficit may be the most important one. But if you tell me that you would like to focus on something else, that's fine with me, as long as you help somebody. Because the problems are so wide. And I'm actually going to end in a few minutes with a movie that sort of illustrates how these peer groups can work. So, very briefly, trauma, abuse, and neglect change the brain. I'll talk about it next time I come to Missouri. Change the brain in very profound ways. It changes your relationship to yourself in very important ways. And then I just want to briefly say something about what we're doing together. And that is that this PTSD diagnosis became the diagnosis du jour. It became the big diagnosis, the Vietnam veteran diagnosis. And we worked to get a new diagnosis, DSM-4, and it's a long story, but that failed, even though we did all the research that showed that what kids suffer from is different. And as a result of that defeat, I eventually got together with the foundation and with Ted Kennedy's office, and we worked with numerous other people to set up the National Child Traumatic Stress Network in order to establish a discipline of childhood trauma. To really learn about the biology, the psychology, the brain changes, the biological changes, the social changes developed by childhood trauma. And much to my amazement, within a few years, that whole network got once again hijacked by the PTSD model, the memory model, rather than the brain change model and self-regulation model. So it's always tough when you see this happen to your brainchild. And so I have all these wonderful colleagues, some of whom you know, and we started to do a survey among all the traumatized kids that are being seen in the network. And what do we see? These are 53 sites around the country. There's data on about 8,000 children, probably. And what we found out is that in the network, almost all these kids have experienced chronic trauma, multiple traumas. Very few have single traumas, and almost all these traumas start before age 10. These kids may come into the clinic afterwards, but the trauma starts early and starts usually within the family. And it's important to really emphasize this. But it also turns out these kids do not suffer from PTSD. So here we're applying all these treatment methods for PTSD, but it's not what these kids suffer from. bothers our kids. The biggest issue is childhood emotional abuse. Not having a parent who is there for you and a parent who hurts you with their words and who puts you down. And our and other people's research shows that having your mother tell you on your 4th day, look what you've done to me. You are a terrible child. I was on my way to become a Metropolitan Opera star, but because you are such a miserable little shit, I've become an alcoholic and you have ruined my life. Those statements are every bit as soul and brain destroying as sexual abuse or physical abuse. So childhood emotional abuse on the hands of people's caregiving is by far the largest issue. Second biggest thing is losing a parent, because a parent goes to jail, goes to the hospital and disappears. Third issue, the caregiver is too depressed, too manic, too drug addicted to take care of you. Next issue, domestic violence. Next issue, childhood sexual abuse. That's number 5 of the row. So these are the issues. It's not being taken care of, most of all, and not specific traumatic incidents. So what are the consequences? Affect dysregulation. Not being able to contain yourself. You become too anxious, too angry, too upset, too out of control, and these kids now all are usually called bipolar illness. They're doped up with antipsychotic medications that ruins the reward system of their brain, which is a national emergency. The next thing that they suffer from is an impairment of attention and concentration. They cannot focus. If a kid cannot focus, a kid cannot learn. If a kid cannot learn, this kid will not grow up to be a contributing member of society. Not a minor issue. They hate themselves. They have problems with impulse control, which leads to alcoholism and all this sort of stuff, and they suffer from aggression and risk-taking. So these are about organisms that no longer work. I had this friend Marilyn Kreutel, who is part of our task force and now president of the International Trauma Society. She did a study a few years ago doing CBT with traumatized adolescent girls, sexually abused adolescent girls. And what she thought about at the end is that these girls became very attached to her and the clinic staff, and she thought clearly what helps these kids most is feeling warmly understood by your therapist. That must be the most important thing. Being a researcher, she measured that and found that in fact does not change people's PTSD. Feeling warmly attached and loved by your therapist does not make any difference. You can dismiss it, but this is fairly good science, so take it seriously. And of course this is counterintuitive. And so Marilyn, being a good researcher, does something called a path analysis. She throws in all kinds of other factors and see what else may have gone into this equation. She looks at if people have received treatment before, they get much better this time. The most important issue is that if the treatment, i.e. the positive relationship with the therapist, leads to affect regulation, people get better. So the most important thing that we can do to help people overcome the trauma is affect regulation, is emotion regulation, is arousal modulation. Now, that being the case, and that being the most important thing in mental health, I'm sure that everybody in this room who is a psychotherapist has taken course after course on physiological self-regulation, right? I don't know of any mainstream school that actually teaches that. Who are the people who know how to do that? Yoga teachers, Qigong teachers, cranial sacral therapists, theater program people. You go to the people who know about affect regulation outside of the psychological and outside the psychiatric systems, because they're the people who know it. The people who know it most, of course, are kindergarten teachers, because they work with affect dysregulated kids and know more than anybody else about dealing with that. So if you run a clinic and you deal with traumatized people, go and take lessons from your kindergarten teacher. They will know it. Okay. I have very little time left, but let me just sort of tell you something for before next time. Next time we'll get back to this. I'm sure we'll have some webcasts. We'll talk to each other via the web, and maybe a bunch of you want to be part of it. Now, let me just quickly say something about the brain. And this is really, I would love to talk about it for many hours, but we don't have the time. Our brain is built up from the bottom up. So when we come into the world, this little part of our brain pops out when we get born. This part of our brain is working. And this part of our brain can do what infants can do. What does the part of the brain do? It can sleep, it can eat, it can urinate, defecate, keeps your body clean, it can breathe, can scream. That's about it for babies, isn't it? So that's what we come into the world with. What's interesting that in trauma, this system gets very disturbed. So if you get traumatized, you get trouble with eating, you get trouble with sleeping, you get trouble with elimination, you get trouble with the most core regulatory functions of the brain. So before you do anything else with traumatized people, you work with that. You learn how to regulate people's brainstem. I'd love to talk more about it, but don't have much time about it. But that's where it starts. You do not regulate the brainstem by talking about how bad you feel. You regulate the brainstem by learning how to breathe slowly, by tapping acupressure points, and by moving in rhythmical fashion with other people. Just like babies move in rhythmical fashion with other people. That's how the brainstem works. The brainstem is not a cognitive part of your brain. And I've been talking with, when we talked with Native Americans here all day, you guys have a whole bunch of rituals that come from your traditions that have to do with moving, drumming, rhythms, and breathing that you should really seriously look at as post-traumatic therapies. I've seen it being done in Japan, I've seen it done in China, I've seen it done in South Africa, so why not do it in Montana and really go back into your own tradition to see what self-regulatory elements you have in your own tradition. And don't ask people in universities to do that for you, because if you've ever been in academia, those guys don't know how to regulate themselves. So the next piece of the brain is this middle part of the brain. So this middle part of your brain is your animal survival brain. And that part of your brain tells you what is safe and what is dangerous and what is good and what's bad in this world. And this part of your brain is developed on a use-dependent manner. So if you grow up scared, terrified and abandoned, this part of your brain helps you to survive horrible, terrible things. And it also will orient your brain towards horror, pain and misery, and make you a person who is primarily oriented to surviving horror, pain and misery, and doesn't make you very useful for anything else. Okay? And then, so that gets hardwired. And then you have this top part of your brain, your frontal lobes, our crowning glory. That's the part of your brain that helps us to understand, to figure things out, to manage things, to see what other people are thinking, to give talks, to give all the wonderful conversations I've had with many of you all the day. It puts us on the same wavelength. The sad news is that most of that part of the brain has absolutely no impact on this part of the brain. And this is where the trauma sits. Let me see what slide I have here. Let me just show you this one, because it's important. The way that our brain is built up is that we're very social people. Look at how many of you showed up to be together here tonight. So most of our brain, over here and over here, I can't tell you with both hands because I'm talking about my microphone, is about being together, talking, yakking, understanding things, getting the same wavelength, figuring things out. And that part of the brain, unfortunately, has no pathways to the emotional brain. So you cannot really talk yourself out of being in love with somebody. You cannot really talk yourself into not being in love with somebody. That's not a rational decision. You cannot talk yourself into not being really freaked out when you see Dick Cheney. It just happens. Just like he gets freaked out when he sees you, you know. It just happens, it's the emotional brain. But there are ways of learning to tolerate it. Because there's a part of your brain that runs from here to here. There's sort of your internal mohawk, to use an old Native American term. It runs from here to here. And this part of your brain is devoted to your relationship to yourself. As research now shows, the only way to change your emotional brain consciously is via the activation of this part of your brain. And how do you do that? By contemplation, interoception, introspection, and meditation. That's basically the only thing that can change the brain in a meaningful way. And so sooner or later, all of us sort of get into the Buddhist type camp, and we try to grow this part of our brain for self-regulation. And what that involves is stillness and paying attention to yourself and to shut up. Just be quiet and feel your internal experience. The sad thing is that traumatized people, that capacity to feel themselves and experience themselves becomes very perturbed. Because there's, again, some other time I may have more time to talk with you guys about it. But people talk about trauma as something that's out there, something that happened a long time ago, even your ancestors, and custers, and wounded knee, and all those things. But that's not what the trauma is. That is just something that happens a while ago, a long time ago. It's over. The past is the past. What happened 3 minutes ago is no longer relevant. The only thing that's relevant is what's happening right now in your body. But when you're traumatized, your body feels like it's happening right now. When you have been raped and somebody touches you, you feel right now like you're being raped. If you have been abandoned, you feel right now like nobody loves you. So the trauma comes to live inside of you, lives in your own internal sensory experience. And the enemy that once was outside is now living inside of you. So the hard thing for traumatized people is that the enemy is living within. And to feel yourself and to notice yourself means that you go to feel and notice very painful, fearful, terrifying things. So traumatized people are terrified of feeling themselves. They would much rather ride a Harley Davidson 120 miles an hour over the Montana highways, or go bungee jumping, or fill themselves up with alcohol, because feeling yourself is a terrifying experience. So the big issue is, how can you help a traumatized person to feel their innards, the internal experiences? And you do that, and that's why I'm so glad you have some sort of alliance with the people who are doing yoga, qigong, and the other methods that have been developed in other cultures where they know about the body, and that people need to be taught to feel safe in their own bodies. And that's, I hope, would have liked to talk much more about it, but I think I want to show you a little videotape, because I sort of have an idea of what the best trauma treatment is. And this is a fun tape, you'll like it, and it's a great way to end, although we'll end a little bit past a half hour. This will take us about 15 minutes. I hope you can stand that. Take a deep breath. What we actually like to do, where we come from, when we see something upsetting, is to regulate our breath. And we live on the coast of Massachusetts, and when our brain gets all cloudy with noises, we rely on some ancient New England stuff, namely in the fall when the cold air of the land hits the warm ocean. A fog comes out of the ocean and we can't see anything, and we have a foghorn. And when we turn the foghorns on, we orient ourselves. So we love to finish our work with making the sound of a foghorn. So maybe you'd like to join me in that. And the way you do that is you put one hand right underneath your navel. This is just an old New England tradition, just to, and you put one hand over here. You take a very deep breath, and you make the sound of the foghorn, and you go, And when you do that, you change the relationship between your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system in your brainstem. And when this part of your brain becomes calm, this part of your brain becomes calm, and this part of your brain becomes calm, you can think more clearly and have more decisions over your life. It is somewhat simple and extremely complicated. Thank you. Good luck to you. You'll need it.